Hello, everyone. I'm Alex from BFI Film Academy, and you're about to watch a recording of a BFI Film Academy lab session on why good people make bad characters. BFI Film Academy labs are all about helping 16 to 25-year-olds break into the screen industries. These monthly practical sessions are led by industry professionals with a focus on explaining the specifics of working in film and television and developing your skills to become the best screen creative you can be. The labs are programmed across 3 strands, which are storytelling, business of film, and career ladder.
Hi everyone. I just want to say that how happy I am to have been invited to give this talk. I'm really excited and I hope that you enjoy it. So I will now share my screen and we can get started. So my talk this evening is why good people make bad characters, creating characters for drama. But first, I think I should tell you a little bit about who I am and why I think I can talk about something like this. So I'll talk a little bit about my origin story. And whenever I think about characters, they're always intertwined with story. The two come together. So I'll explain how I ended up here talking in front of you all about how to create compelling characters. So I picked this picture because I'm a big sister and my little sister looks very goofy. So it's obviously my favourite. So who am I and what do I know about characters? So I grew up as the chatty big sister in a household full of books. Me and my best friend would record radio shows onto cassette. That ages me a bit. As tweens, my friends and I would make our own versions of Ricki Lake and Star Trek The Next Generation on camcorder. They weren't any good. And for my media studies GCSE, I spent so long writing our slasher script that we had no time left to film it. So that's the kind of person that I am. And you can tell from this that I was always kind of interested in stories and storytelling, as so many of us are. But I got distracted, as people do. I got distracted by traveling. First of all, this is me just spending a lot of time in different parts of the world, having too good a time, really. I also got really distracted by history. I thought I wanted to be a medieval historian. I was very interested in the Roman Empire, of all things. That guy looking important on the left is Emperor Justinian. We've got a map of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire in the top corner. And in the bottom right corner, there's a picture of me not having a lot of fun in a very fancy library. So that was the kind of stuff that I was looking at. But I got to be 29 years old, and I remembered that I really loved creating stories. And I was lucky enough to get a job in radio. And over the next couple of years, I lived in Oxford, where I'd been temping after ditching my PhD. I then moved to London, where I was very lucky that I could live there rent-free. I couldn't have afforded to live in London on my own. I lived in Belfast, where I got too into fringe theatre, saw some terrible things and some really good things, as you would expect. And I lived in Birmingham, where unexpectedly I learnt to box. I have now retired, undefeated. I just did the one fight. But most importantly, Birmingham is the place where I wrote storylines and created characters for the long-running radio soap opera The Archers, and that's where I first had the job title story producer. And part of what a story producer does is that they write storylines and they create characters. Now I live in Cardiff and I've done the same work for the long-running medical drama Casualty, and I've done it in development, where I've been working on my own projects and working with other writers, where very often at the beginning of a project you start thinking about who are your main characters and what is your story. The two kind of come together as you're kind of working on your ideas. So what is a story producer? And I think I'll explain a bit about this, because I think even if you're a writer or a writer-director, and you might not ever have heard that term, it's quite applicable in your process when you're kind of working up your ideas when you're writing. So basically what a story producer does, oh, hang on, I've interrupted myself because I want to clear up some jargon, because unfortunately, talking about story is something where it's really easy to sound pretentious and like you know everything, and actually you're just not being very clear. So bear with me while I deal with some jargon. When you talk about stories and storylining, you often talk about breaking story. It's nothing to do with the news. What it means is it's the process of working out an episode or a film's blueprint. So that's what breaking story is. It's not kind of a headline on your phone. It's kind of, I always think of it as like being in the story mines, hammering away, like chiseling out what your story is. A more useful way to think about it is a whiteboard filled with bad handwriting and lots of arrows and lots of, if this goes here, then that goes there, and wouldn't that be a good start and wouldn't that be a good end? It's that kind of thing. That's breaking story. And if you're a writer, you're breaking story. You're figuring out what your story is. That's all it means. Beats. So a beat is a unit of action which propels the story forward. That's what a beat is. So the example that I've given here is you might have a character who is cooking a lasagna and she's telling her husband that she wants a divorce. And the beat, the unit of action which changes the story, is asking for the divorce. It's not the lasagna. Because actually, probably by the time that you make it, the lasagna has turned into a bag of crisps and the house has turned into a park bench, and the husband who was there in person is now on the end of a phone. And there'll be lots of changes along the way, but the thing that you can't change, the thing that you can't lose, is the fact that your character is asking her husband for a divorce. So that's what a beat is. And it's something that you're confronted with quite a lot when you might be under pressure to find cuts, to make edits, have an idea of like what really matters about the story we're telling. That's often where we end up talking about beats. And then you've also got acts. So acts are a way of subdividing a story. They're bigger than individual scenes. And in the simplest terms, and people have all kinds of methodologies and ways of approaching it and kind of ways that they want to approach talking about acts, but in the simplest term, Act 1 is the start of the story, Act 2 is the middle, and Act 3 is the end. And if you've ever heard people talk about a problem in Act 3 or an Act 3 problem, you get it a lot when people discuss huge kind of superhero franchise film. They might go, oh, but Act 3 was a real drag. And what it means is that feeling that you get in your seat about 2.5 hours in, where you know there's another hour to go, and you're just feeling a little bit kind of annoyed slash bored slash, you know, it's you're just at the beginning of the end and you're not yet at the end. That's your classic kind of Act 3 problem. A different kind of Act 3 problem is where the story resolves, and really it resolves in a way as the end of it, but it's not satisfying. And you leave the cinema annoyed or with questions or feeling that it didn't work. So Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Something that was once said about me was this quote by an old boss of mine, which was that breaking story, that is working out what the story is, breaking story with Jenny is like being in therapy, but you don't know if you're the analyst or the patient. And I'm going to circle back round to kind of what that means at the end of this talk, and the qualities that you need when you're thinking about stories and character, the qualities of being curious about other people, rigorous in what you see in people's characters and the ways you can use that kind of material. So let me move on. Writing storylines. I want to stress that deep in your bones, you understand this. You have an intuitive understanding of this. It's the beginning, it's the middle, it's the end. It's the story. Stories have main characters, they have sidekicks and antagonists. There's a journey. Things aren't the same at the end as they were at the beginning, and characters change as they seek to overcome obstacles and to confront their own shortcomings. I think fundamentally, a story which works is one that we care about. And if you think about your own childhood, if it was a childhood where you had books around or stories that were told to you, you had your preferences. You had the book that you got as a gift from your grandma that you looked at once, but it wasn't really a thing. And you have the book that you go to again and again and again and you revisit, and there's just something about it that works for you. When you create storylines, you're creating the structure which we're going to build upon. So it's not dialogue and it's not scenes. And we talk a lot about beats, which I've talked about, structure, how the story comes together, stakes, which is basically why it matters, and journeys. So like all of us, you start with the very worst thing of all, which is a blank page. This is just the worst bit. The very worst bit of writing a storyline is when you've got nothing. Because even when you've got something really bad and you don't like anything, you can always make it better. So you shouldn't let the blank page terrify you. It's kind of like, it's a hump to get over. Everything is better from that point on. And this is where some people do kind of rely on various tools. They will talk about 3-act structure or 5-act structure, or they might focus on the 10 questions, which is another way of interrogating a story. Do we care? Does the person change? Is the end satisfying? These kind of questions. Or you can just focus on different questions that come up. You know, if a storyline or a story has stakes, you're asking really, like, does it matter? Like, does it actually matter? If you write a storyline and your main character is trying to choose between a cheese sandwich and a ham sandwich, but actually they quite like both, you've got a lack of stakes. Like, that's one of the problems that you've got, is it just doesn't matter very much whatever one they go for. Or you might be worried that your story doesn't have enough turning points, and turning points are kind of like beats. They're those units of action. They're the things where things change for your characters. So you might have, you know, your story that I talked about earlier, the one that I invented for you, the woman asking her husband for a divorce. That's a beat. It's not really a story. Just not enough happens. And if you read that in the script, you'd think, I feel a bit hard done by here, because it's just a moment. It's a scene, really. So you think, okay, well, I want to figure out now, why is she asking for the divorce? Or what happens after she asks for the divorce? What kind of story are we telling? Or another question that you might ask yourself, and this is an interesting one, is whether the story that you're trying to tell subverts expectations. And that sounds quite technical, but really all it means is, are you surprised? Was there anything about this story? Sometimes we get a lot of satisfaction from knowing the ending of a story. There are certain tropes and conventions, and actually it's what we like. If you're a fan of, I don't know, if you're a fan of rom-coms or something like that, you have a pretty good sense that they're probably going to end up together. And probably part of what you enjoy is the journey. But even within that, over the really good rom-coms, the ones that you rave about, or you go back to, you watch again, they still manage to convince you that the couple might not end up together. So that's something where those expectations can be subverted. So going back to the kind of job that I do and have done, what a story producer does on a show like Casualty, or a show like The Archers, or a show like Vera, a long-running crime drama, all kinds of shows use story producers, is that very often they work with a team and they create a document of the storylines. And that document goes out to the writers, who then turn it into scripts. So it's kind of the stage before the script. But I think when you're writing, if you don't work with a story producer, you're doing that bit yourself. You've probably beaten out the story, you've broken that story, you kind of know what it is and where you're going. And then you kind of get to work kind of on your scenes, turning it into scripts. And it's interesting to reflect that for quite a long time, I didn't really respect this skill that I had. And that was probably partly because it was me doing it. But I think that mixture of the analytical, why doesn't this story work? And the creative, what happens next? Is rarer than you'd think. And I think you know it's quite rare because a lot of people will watch a film or a TV show and they'll go, I didn't really like that very much. But they don't really want to get into the weeds of why. And probably the kind of person that you guys are, if you want to talk like this, and the kind of person that I am, is that we like digging into the why of it. And sometimes you didn't like something because you didn't like the cinematography, or you didn't like the editing, or you didn't like the sound design. But very often, because story is so fundamental to us, it's how we understand the world, you didn't get on with an element of the story, or you didn't like a certain character, and by like them, it might be not, doesn't mean that you wanted them to be your best mate, but you didn't find their motivations didn't make sense. Like you didn't understand why they did what they did, or the storyline just disappointed you in that pesky third act. And often it's people like us that's the walk home from the cinema. Or when you turn the streamer off and you turn to your friend and you go, yeah, I like the start, that bit was good, but I didn't like that bit, and we dig into the weeds of it. And then often, if you get carried away, and I often get carried away, you start thinking about what they should have done, and you start creating the TV show that they should have made, or the film that they should have made, and you start going, well, you see, I would have moved that around, and I would have gone there, and I would have told that, and put that focus on, and before you know it, hours have passed, and you've entirely reinvented the show or the film that was so irritating you. So, what I would say about story, and this brings me around to character, is that everything starts with character. Nice is death. And what I mean by this is that nice, reasonable, or perfect people, like woe betide you have a perfect character, react in dull and predictable ways. So an essential part of your storyliner's toolkit is to make sure that the characters in your show are active and they're flawed. And by active, what I mean is they're doing things. They're making changes in their life and they're making changes in the world. They're not someone that things just happen to. They're making choices. And I think the best characters don't just have one flaw, like, well, they've got a bit of a temper. They've got several kind of overlapping flaws that come out in different ways. And now I want to get on to talking about characters, and I want to use a real example of a character that I made and to kind of lead you through the process of character creation. And I've zoned in on character creation because it's the most fun bit of the job. Like, it's really fun creating characters, especially characters that you get excited about. And it's also really important because if you people your world and your writing with nice, reasonable characters who just wouldn't do things that are unreasonable or not very nice, it actually makes you a less reasonable person because you get frustrated with your own characters because you're trying to tell a story about a heist gone wrong, but everyone just kind of wants to explain why it's gone wrong to the police, or they want to cut a deal. Or you've got a thriller, but actually kind of your hitman isn't really much of a hitman and he doesn't like it very much and he's thinking of quitting it. And he doesn't get drawn back in because he doesn't have any flaws. He's quite happy being an ex-hitman. And you end up getting really frustrated with this kind of characters. So I'll talk you through a way to possibly avoid that. Here is a journey through a creation. Let me introduce you to Stevie Lash.
Why are you here?
Just here for the drama.
Do you not have any filter? You know the answer to that?
He's little. Hello. You consultant, baby.
Oh. Perfect wife material or what?
Ooh, give it up for the Holby lads. Lads.
I'm really quite drunk.
It's okay.
Oh, mate, I've got a...
Seriously, she's with me. I'm sorry.
Great. I can't wait to read the memo.
Oh, Paul, don't forget this, yeah?
She shoots. She misses. Schmuck buddies. Ooh, somebody's marriage wasn't perfect. Naughty girl reporting to the headmaster's office.
Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, I haven't, no. What's your name again?
Bitch.
And how are we spelling that?
Okay, so here's where we are. That was Stevie Nash, and she's a character that I created, and she's a character in the TV show Casualty. She's still in it. And let me tell you about where she came from. So, in the autumn of 2020, me and the series producer knew that we wanted a new senior emergency department consultant. So basically, the show Casualty is set in the fictional world of an emergency department, like an A&E. And we had lots of male characters at the time, and we were seeking to rebalance that. So we knew that we wanted a new senior female consultant, and that's what we were after. And I was tasked with creating a character. And that was a brilliant brief. Like when you think about being asked, can you just create a character, but you're not really given any lines to draw in. The brief was just, we need a female consultant. What have you got? And whenever I'm thinking about a new character, I start by pinching from real life. And the inspiration for Stevie was my mum, Leslie Thompson, a highly unusual person. Let me tell you a little bit about her. So here's a few things about my mum which I thought would be interesting and might be interesting to put into a new character. I have never in my life known my mum to worry about what other people think of her. Like, I've just never heard her say it. Not in all my years. She's not someone who frets about this stuff. I mean, I just find that remarkable. I'm constantly worrying what people think of me. But she doesn't seem to do it. It's kind of interesting. She doesn't have many friends, but the friendships that she has last decades, and she exhibits total loyalty. She's intensely protective of her family. She is, you might say, a bit tribal, a bit, there's you and there's me, there's my lot and there's everyone else. And again, I thought that's an interesting kind of quirk of someone with that kind of protective instinct. You're in the club, and it's a small club. I have a small family. That club, couple of close mates, and you do anything for them. It interested me. She's never cared about social convention, which I used to find absolutely excruciating, but now I think of it as a kind of superpower. I mean, when I was a teenager, it was awful. You know, everyone in the small town where I grew up knew my mum. Like, just everyone knew her because she was such a personality. And it was kind of just mortifying and awful. But, you know, it's kind of remarkable too. She was a nurse for many years, and she brought very high standards to her work. And that would sometimes create conflict in pursuit of what's right. She'd fall out with people because she thought they should do things better. And she has this kind of black and white sense of morality. For me, everything's in shade of grey. But for her, like, there's right and there's wrong. I thought that was kind of interesting. She's very self-reliant, you know, very kind of just happy, like just doing her own thing. And I've noticed as the years have gone by that she's just always herself. Like, whoever she's talking to, she's not someone who kind of twists and bends and wants to please and wants to fit in. She's just herself. And she would say, if she met someone and they didn't particularly get on, that was their problem, not her problem. So as you can probably tell, she's different to me. But I thought these characteristics were interesting. So that was the starting point, just pinching from my own mother. But now I'm going to take you through how you might take that kind of inspiration and do something called creating a character diamond. And this is just something that anyone can do if you're thinking about your characters. And I'm going to talk through a process of taking that initial idea for me, my mum, let's put her in a TV show, and then kind of filling out the character in various ways so that she the character you end up with feels three-dimensional. And the way that I always think about that is you want a character that you feel like you could just hold in the palm of your hand, like you can just see around them. And also you want a character who, when you put pressure on them, that is, you give them a story, you give them challenges, you give them problems, might behave in a couple of different ways. They're three-dimensional, as we all are. So here's character diamonds. The way to start with your character diamond, the first thing, is the mask. And what the mask is what does your character project? Like, how do they seem when you first know them? If you just know them a short period of time, what are the words that you would use to describe them? Let's think about this in terms of Stevie. So I wanted Stevie to be funny, because I want all my characters to be funny. I think a lot of us are funny in different ways. You might be goofy, you might be dry, you might be surreal, you might like pranks. Pranks aren't that funny, but you might be into pranks. But I definitely wanted this new character to be funny. I wanted her to be confident. And partly that's because she's a consultant, she's a senior doctor. I think she kind of knows her mind. She can deal with patients. She can deal with difficult patients. So someone who's funny and who's confident. I also wanted her to have a bit of an edge in the way that my mum used to have a bit of an edge. She's mellowed now. So I wanted her to be quite fierce. One way of thinking about the mask is it's what people would say about your character in the loos. And I could imagine them saying, that new doctor, God, she's a bit scary, she's a bit fierce. I really wanted that for the character. And I also wanted Stevie to be a bit chaotic. And by that I mean that I wanted her to be a character that I knew would be in her 30s, thereabouts, but who didn't have life sorted. That kind of TV cliche, if you get in your 30s and somehow you've acquired your husband or your wife and your lovely house, a house that you could in no way afford, and your dog and your child, and everything is very ordered. That just doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel real for me. It doesn't feel real for any of the people that I know. So I wanted this air of someone who hasn't quite got it together. So that was the mask. The next thing that you think about is the fear. So you kind of go from the external to the deeply internal. And you have to think about, what are the 2 a.m. thoughts that this character is having? I mean, quite often we're driven by our fears as much as by what we want, right? We want to avoid the things that really scare us and that cause us pain, that cause us harm. So what might Stevie's fears be? Well, I kind of thought, thinking of my mum, that she would really hate to let people down. That's kind of a thing that would motivate her, that she'd want to avoid that. It's that kind of tribal quality I talked about, that thing of, you know, ride or die. If I'm on your side, I'm on your side to the very end. And then what she would hate is the idea that she's disappointed someone that relied on her. I also thought, and this is partly because I knew that I was creating a senior character, a senior doctor, that being powerless is something that Stevie would really hate. Lack of control, lack of power. Someone who's used to having power, used to wielding power in a hospital, suddenly not having that, she would find that very difficult. And she'd stop feeling like herself. And the third fear, and this is often a fear that is in the mix, you find it on a lot of character diamonds for a lot of characters who seem very different from one another, being unworthy of love. I think the deep down core of this character is that she feels that maybe, just maybe, she's a little unworthy of love. Scary stuff, scary stuff. Next we talk about the strongest traits. And the strongest traits are, what does your character use to overcome the difficulties? Because as the writer or the story producer, you're going to be putting problems in their way. All that you're doing is creating obstacles and beats and challenges, and how are you going to push them? How does your character overcome your problems? So what's Stevie's strongest traits? She's charismatic. I think she can persuade people. I think she has a kind of an elan, a grace, a wit. She can rely on that to get her through. I think she's brave. I think she's a brave woman, putting herself in the line of fire, right? It ties into that idea of loyalty, of not wanting to let people down. It might mean that you're brave. You put yourself in the line of fire. I think she's single-minded. I think she's got a kind of a driven quality. That ties in, again, with my mum and her being someone who had really high standards. I think Stevie's the same. She's got that kind of drive to achieve. And turns out I'd also written that, high standards. And that applies to this character in the workplace. It's not good enough. It's not good enough to slack. It's not good enough to give poor patient care. Now the true self is interesting. So the true self is basically, what is your character like when they've completed their arc? So in a show like Casualty, it's a long-running drama. But if you're writing a film, you're taking your character on a journey from the start all the way to the end. And you're going to be thinking, well, how do they change? And the true self is the completed character. In some ways, you wouldn't want to tell a story with your character as their true self, because that's quite a nice person, and we know that nice is death, and we don't want nice characters. But if Stevie was to complete her journey and to grow and to change and to have her happily ever after, what would she be like? She'd be a team player. Yeah, she'd look after others, but not just that in that sense of you and me against the world. In general, she'd look after people. She'd be reliable. It's that other side of chaotic. She'd be up for turning up where she's meant to be and mucking in. It's that team player energy. She'd be a peacemaker. That fierceness, the edge would go off that fierceness a little bit, and she'd just want us all to get on. That's nice, isn't it? Getting on. And she'd be loving. She'd be able to give and to receive love. She wouldn't be scared of that. It wouldn't be holding her back. She'd think, yeah, I can do that. I mean, this sounds like a great person, right? A great pal. You don't really want your character to become their true self, not when they've still got work to do. Then you talk about their trouble traits, and the trouble traits are what is going to trip them up. How are they going to get in their own way? When everything's going right and things go wrong, why is that? And you can probably guess what some of these things are, just from the character that I've described. So she's selfish. She's a selfish character. She's looking out for number one. If we know her true self is that she'll be a team player, mucking in, selfish is, it's just me actually. It's part of that high standards, right? It's part of her confidence. That can mean that you could be selfish. She's unreliable. She'll let you down. She'll let down the people that she cares about, even the people that she really cares about. But also not just her core people. She might kind of just let down people that she shouldn't let down. A bit unreliable people that she should really know better with. That's the chaos coming to bear. That's the sense of not having your life together, not being where you should be. She's arrogant. The arrogant, you can see that comes from being charismatic, comes from being confident, comes from having these high standards. You just think a lot of yourself. She's a bit cocky. It's quite unpleasant, really, this version of Stevie. And she's reckless. We know that she's fierce, and we know that she's brave. So yeah, she's someone that can make bad decisions, really bad decisions. And the final part of Character Diamond is the dark side. And the dark side is if you were to turn your character you're creating not into the hero of your story, but to the villain. What if everything was to go wrong for them? What if they were to curdle and become someone that you don't much like? Well, then you guys could feel this in yourselves. She'd be manipulative. She's got that in her. She could do that. She could be the puppet master, using that charisma, but to a bad purpose, right? Being selfish. She could be vengeful. She's fierce, pretty fierce. It's not on here, but you get a sense that she's probably got a bit of a temper. Volatile. That's being reckless and unreliable. Someone when you don't know how she's going to be, she might blow up at you, she might be okay one day, she might not be okay the next day. Kind of someone you're a bit wary of. And ruthless. It's the selfishness, it's the recklessness. it's the fierceness. So hopefully, through running through a character diamond, you've got a sense of this character. Do we know her yet? Maybe. Better than we did, right? Better than when I just said, oh, she was my mum, because none of you know my mum. So you probably get a sense of her at her very best, and also the ways that she's not so great, and also what we don't want her to be. For example, nowhere is she described as feminine, or as a girl boss, or an ice queen, terms where I don't really know what they mean. We haven't specified ethnicity, or whether Stevie has a disability. We haven't talked about her sexuality, because creating this character isn't about identity characteristics, it's about making the person feel real. And then they can be whatever you want them to be. But you still might have some doubts about the character. She might feel a little bit blurry. So the next step is that I wrote her biography. And this is a quote that inspired me. It's from Don DeLillo. It says, "I walked real streets and did things slap bang and felt angry, a danger to others and a distant mystery to myself." And the thing that I liked about that was the idea of a character who does things slap bang. It's like recklessness, it's the chaos, it's the bravery, it's the fierceness, it's the sense of fun, but also being a distant mystery to myself. And I think Stevie, like all of us, doesn't have a lot of insight into what makes her tick. You know, we see it after the event. Something happens in our life and we blow up about it and we get upset. And a week later or a month later or a year later we go, oh, I was probably upset about that thing over there. But we don't know it at the time. We have this kind of inconstant sense of clarity into our own motivations. So here are some notes from a very long biography. She lives in a hotel because she can't be asked to rent. She doesn't think she's going to stick around very long. Chaos. She won't be parted from her scuffed leather jacket, and out of work she wears jumpsuits, never dresses. Maybe an element of the tomboy in here. She gets takeaway delivered to the ED because it helps with the paperwork, but she never cleans up after herself. So you walk into the staff room after a long shift and there's a load of Popeyes containers, but no Popeyes. Grease marks on the paperwork. Yeah, she's kind of selfish, you know? But you still like her for it. And she believes today's eyeliner is tomorrow's smoky eye. I loved that idea. That came from someone in my team. So yeah, she'll make an effort to look nice, but inconstant. We fall back around to that idea of chaos. And the full biography was actually accidentally leaked online, and to my shame, it had some swearing in. But very luckily, the fans really loved it. I think they could see the passion with which we talked about this character. So then we had to introduce the character with a story which fits them, and by fit them I mean a story which brings out their strengths and their weaknesses so that we understand who they are. And here's what we had. So Stevie had a younger sister called Emma, who she betrayed. Recklessness. Before they could reconcile, Emma was seriously injured and taken to the ED. The attending doctor was another one of our regular characters, a guy called Ethan Hardy. But Ethan was struggling with an issue of his own and he botched intubation. What that means is Emma was left without oxygen and she suffered life-changing injuries. She entered a persistent vegetative state from which she never recovered. Stevie suspected medical negligence, but the hospital trust backed Ethan. In the years before Stevie joins our world, she's been nursing both her sister and a desire for revenge. So that's how we introduced Stevie into the show, to get a sense of what this character is like and what she's been living with. But having created the character, it's time to go out of the story team and into the real world. So we'd made her and we'd written her into our storylines, and our writers were the ones who give her dialogue and breathe life into her. And one of our writers, Hilary, just got her. So we used her scripts as the early benchmark and we sent them to our casting team to get to work. And at the same time, our colleagues in hair and makeup and costume and art got to work on her look. Casting provided options to us, and from these, Ellie Lawless, who plays Stevie, was the clear favourite. And we lucked out with Ellie because she brought a quality to Stevie that wasn't necessarily on the page. See if you can guess it.
just wanted to hear your voice.
It was vulnerability. You know, Ellie has this remarkable ability to show vulnerability, and actually nowhere in the biography that I'd written did it say that Stevie was a character who cried or who showed emotion easily. Nothing of the kind. And that's exactly what Ellie brought to the part. And potentially the character that I created, the one that I've just talked you all through, could have been a bit mean. Like, we might not have got beyond that mask. We might have just seen someone that was fierce and confident and funny, but you didn't like them very much. But through casting Ellie, we got someone who could really bring that vulnerability. So the big question, we created the character, did it work? Well, yeah, it did, actually. She's an enduringly popular character. And it's really lovely. It's been really heartening to see how much the audience have taken Stevie to their heart, even though in many ways she's not an easy person. I want to just talk quickly about being the boss, and I don't mean being the boss in terms of being head of a hierarchy, because I'm not the boss, but in terms of creating your character. Because when you create a character, you feel like you own them. You feel like, well, they're mine, you know? And it's worth wondering if you're as in charge as you think you are. So throughout this whole talk, I've been telling you about my career and my creative method and just one character which resulted from it. And it's been a bit egocentric. It's been me for, 45 minutes. Here's what I do, here's why I do it, all of this stuff. But you'll have seen that as soon as Stevie left my computer, she was tinkered with and expanded upon by countless numbers of people. Every time a writer has given her dialogue, she's changed a little bit. Every time a director has given the artist a note, she's changed a little bit more. And it would be very easy if I felt that I owned this character. It would be easy for that to drive me crazy. Because what are you doing to my creation? You know. But here's the thing. In television and in film, it's all about collaboration. And whenever you create a character, it's really important to keep in view that what really matters about them, their essential qualities, that's what matters. A bit like in the way that in the story, it's the beats that matter, not the little tiny details around the edges. So I think it's just really important because when you create characters, you do kind of love them and you think they're great, and also they came out of your head. So you do have that sense of ownership, but it's really important to kind of mitigate it and to kind of keep it in perspective, because if you just wanted them to be yours, you should be a novelist. We're all about working with other people, collaborating with other people and seeing what they bring, what their ideas are for your character. So here's an example of an extraneous detail. Stevie has this scuffed leather jacket. Right, I put it in the bio. It's a clear character note. She wears a scuffed leather jacket. What colour is it? I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's black, right? Except it's not black. She's got a brown leather jacket. And that's absolutely fine because we don't have to control everything, and we make better work when we don't. And I'm really grateful to the costume department because they knew what suits the artist playing Stevie, what suits Ellie. I mean, I can't dress myself, let alone anyone else. It was just an idea. The black leather jacket, in my head, is just a gesture to the kind of things she might wear, the kind of ways she might get styled. But costume are experts on this. They know all about it. Because TV and film are such collaborative mediums, your job as the creator of a character, whatever your job title, is to fire up your team and to get them excited about your characters. And as part of that, you have to accept that they will look different to how you imagined. The artists, the actors will bring different qualities out in them. You'll see that. And to be honest, that isn't something to be kind of scared of or precious about. That's the really thrilling bit. Because that's when your idea is made flesh. And your characters, even the one based on your mum, has the capacity to surprise you. I think that's utterly remarkable. I want to come to some conclusions, and then we'll finish and we can do Q&A. The most important thing, and what I hope has been clear through this talk, is that when you're creating characters, really hone in on what those flaws are. Really think about them. Often, when we're thinking about story, we start off by thinking about people we admire. A character as clever as Zadie Smith, as affable as Ellis James, as passionate as Gareth Bale, as funny as Kathy Burke. It makes perfect sense, particularly if you're creating your protagonist. You want them to go out there and to be active in your story. You want them to go and conquer demons, to slay dragons, to defeat the bad guy. So you naturally think of their strengths, what is so great about them. It's kind of where we all go to. But the other question is, how do they trip themselves up? How do they get in their own way? How do they screw up and start again? Because that's like all of us. And it's worth saying here that you don't have to make them likable to make them relatable. And I think that actually it's niceness isn't very likable. It sounds counterintuitive, but you know, if someone's just nice, it's slightly bland, right? But if someone's a bit of a case, they're a real character. Like if sometimes they utterly confound you, or they make you laugh, or they surprise you, you know, they might not be like you, but I think we relate to flaws, because we all have flaws, and we're trying our best, and we're doing our best, and we're getting in our own way, and we're screwing up, and we have these strengths that we rely on in hard times, and we've got these troublesome traits where we let ourselves down, and we've got the fears that keep us up at night, and we've got maybe a hazy idea of what we might be like in the future when we're done, when our journey is complete. So finally, everything to do with story is about being either the patient or the analyst. And it's about trying to understand what makes other people tick. And through that, sometimes you figure out what makes you tick as well. In my experience, and I've done story for a good few years now, it actually doesn't help with your own life. It's really worth saying that. Even if you're really curious about other people and you create great characters and you're always trying to figure out what makes people tick, it doesn't actually mean that you get any better at living your own life. You'll still make tons of mistakes all the time, and it's kind of unavoidable, really. And that kind of brings me back to that DeLillo quote about being a mystery to yourself. We're all mysteries to ourselves in the way that the best characters are too. So one thing I would say about creating characters, pinch from your real life, pinch from yourself, but don't expect it to make you living your own life any easier. That's just a bit of a caveat on character creation. There's a bit of a parallel between creating characters and coaching, where you're kind of thinking about your strengths and your weaknesses. And you can see it a little bit in the character diamond, how you could link up various qualities around the diamond. If you're a romantic, probably going to get your heart broken. You might get your heart broken a lot. You might time and time again fall in love. And sometimes it works out. And sometimes there you are, picking up the pieces of your broken heart. But that's because that's the kind of person that you are. That's the way you live your life. Love is important to you. If you're loyal, if you're an intensely loyal person, It could, in certain circumstances, maybe make you a pushover. Maybe you don't have the hard conversation you need to with the person you're loyal to. Or maybe you're following the wrong person and they get you into trouble. Or maybe you fear being alone and that's why you're really loyal. If you're ambitious, we often think ambition is a good thing. But if you're really ambitious and driven and you get all the way to the top, very top of your industry, everything you ever wanted, you find that you're up there and you're on your own. So there are these kind of links, I think, with strengths and with weaknesses that it's worth thinking about. So all I would say is, to conclude really, is if you have characters or you're making some, I really encourage you to try making diamonds and to think about what's wrong with them as well as what's right with them. Because I promise you, we'll love them even more for their flaws. That's just the truth of it. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.
Stevie Nash, new consultant. Hey, I could do sensitive.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was fantastic. Loads of questions in the Q&A box, loads of really, really nice comments. Thank you. That was such a detailed discussion. It was fantastic. And also thank you for the jargon buster. So often events like these assume loads of knowledge and are therefore inaccessible for newbies like myself. So yeah, really, really, really nice to hear. But let's jump into the questions immediately so that we can try to answer as many of them as possible. Let me just put in the first one. So Emily is asking, how do you approach creating strong beats?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think it helps to know kind of what size of story that you're telling. So on a show like Casualty or lots of long-running shows, lots of dramas that we will watch, there'll be several strands. There might be an A, B, C, D strand, that kind of thing. So it's kind of, you have to kind of work your story to the size, to what you're trying to tell. So, if you have a little comedy C story, the beats don't have to be kind of massive and earth-shattering. The beat might be about a kind of a miscommunication between two people, and actually they kind of get a bit offended, and then at the end of it, they kind of make up, and it's all okay. Because you know that the kind of the tone that you're working is light comedy. But you also know, if you've got an A story and it's life and death, and it's really dramatic, and you want the audience to be kind of bawling their eyes out, you know that you kind of need enough beats. It needs to be big enough to kind of fill kind of the space in your episode or the space in your film. But really it kind of comes with practice and going back and kind of interrogating them over again and thinking, how could this be better? And that's where very often when you're breaking story, it's really useful pitching your story to someone else, to a friend or a collaborator, and just kind of saying, essentially, let me tell you a story. There's this person, and you talk your way through it, and then see, where do they stop paying attention, or where do they get confused, or where do they go, oh yeah, I thought that was going to happen. And that's a really good mirror for you to go back and think, okay, how can we make these stronger? How do we increase the stakes or subvert expectations? So it's always easier breaking story, I would say, not on your own. It's hard to do on your own.
Great, thank you. And do you find you have a specific way around with developing your stories, like a character first and then your story?
Yeah, I tend to start with character. So I tend to sort of think, you might think, we need a story for Stevie, for instance. And sometimes you might have what's quite good to think about if you're thinking, I don't know, in terms of a 6-episode TV series or something, you might think of what the big story is over 6 eps, and then you kind of chunk it up into smaller eps. And sometimes when you chunk it up, you realize that you don't have enough story for your 6 eps, and that's where you end up adding an extra twist or an extra element. I was doing it just recently with a friend of mine. We had a story that we were really keen on, and we beated the whole thing out. And our second act was just really boring. Like, we just didn't have enough happening in it. And so we had to kind of think, you know, either this is a 5-ep series, or we've really got to do something and bring in a new element, a new character, something which kind of juices it. Or another thing that you do quite a lot is you pull story forward. And something that, a bad habit that you can easily get into, is that you have a really good idea for the end of the story, really, and you're so excited about it. And you kind of want to save it for later, like hoarding your nuts for winter. And a really good boss of mine always just said, play the hand you've got. If you've got a good idea, use it. And trust your creativity. You're going to have a better idea. Like, when you get onto that next episode, there'll be something new. And I think a thing that a lot of us do when we're starting out is you spread your story too thin. So I would just say, if you have good ideas, cram them in till you've got too many. That's always a good place to start from.
Sounds good. And then somebody's asking, how would you advise somebody who's better with plots on storylines and already has one established, so has those ideas that you spoke about, but doesn't know who their characters are and is stuck in character creation mode?
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting dilemma to have. I think I would sort of have a bit of a reflection about just the people that you know, or the characters you've seen in TV and film that you find interesting and what you find compelling about them. And I would think, you know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Just see if you kind of think, actually, you know, my main character is slightly dull. How can I make them a bit less dull? Or sometimes it's that you've written a character to an identity characteristic instead of as a person. So your main character might be fine, but their mum might be like a generic mum, and she's just kind of in her 50s and she's always making roast dinners. And sometimes it's useful to kind of strip all that away. I'm going to forget that she's a mum. I'm going to forget that they're the boss. Who is this person? And kind of build them up 3-dimensionally using something like a character diamond. And then it's like, oh yeah, and also they're a mum. And I think that's a way that you can stop kind of writing characters that feel like a bit cliched, like accidentally cliched, because you've kind of put that person in a box. So kind of you can move around and think, if this character was my main character, what would they be like?
Great, thank you. And just a very quick question referring to the first part of your presentation. What are the 10 questions?
I had a horrible feeling I'd be asked this. I think if you Google 10 questions storylining, it will come up. But it is things like, how does it start? Why does it matter? Why should we care? Whose story is it? How does it end? What changes? It's kind of like that. It's these really fundamental questions. And sometimes when you're storylining, it's not going very well, it's because it's the wrong person's story. So it might be that the person who's passive, you think it's their story, but actually they're the person that stuff is happening to, and it's the other person's story. So for instance, I don't know, I'm struggling to come up with an example, but like that can happen quite a lot when I'm storylining, is I kind of switch perspective. And I think it's not actually Stevie's story. Lots of things are happening to her, but she's not driving it. It's Ethan's story.
Great, thank you. And I think some people have found the 10 questions already, have Googled them. So Anya and Hayden both shared. Oh, everyone is sharing the 10 questions. So yeah, please look in the chat to find out what the 10 questions are. And in the meantime, another question for you, Jenny. How much does genre affect your approach to creating a character? Are there things you consider when drafting them?
That's a really good question because I think it used to feel that there were certain characters that were kind of linked to certain kinds of genre, and you wouldn't kind of get them outside. But recently, like I think about, I don't know, kind of the work of Harry and Jack Williams that are kind of they have a production company and they've made things like Boat Story was quite a recent drama that they've done, and quite often they'll create characters that are like a gangster, and in some respects it's quite a cliched gangster perhaps, but he's lost the love of his life, so actually he's also romantic, and actually like what he fears is not getting together with the new woman that he's fallen in love with. So I think actually you can afford to kind of, because genre will be in like your style of storytelling, but you can have characters that are still neurotic or funny or anxious or have a really hot temper. Like you can people your world with all kinds of people, but then it's still a neo-noir, or it's still a thriller, or it's still a rom-com. And I think if you have three-dimensional characters, you can place them in all those kinds of worlds, or it's still sci-fi. So I think genre is very interesting to think about, but I don't think I let it hinder me if I was creating characters.
Makes sense. And how does thinking about a true self and dark side that you mentioned change if the character ultimately gives into their dark side, or if that kind of story has been planned from the outset?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because both the true self and the dark side, what they are is they're the end of your character's journey. So in a sense, they're both the same. And sometimes on long-running shows, or if you're, I don't know, doing the sequel of a sequel of a sequel of a film, you might find actually your character has changed enough over time that they've become their true self or their kind of dark side. And then you've kind of hit a bit of a wall with the character because you're like, oh well, now they've become either irredeemably bad and like nobody's going to root for them because they've become Darth Vader or another contemporary reference, more contemporary reference, or they just become so bland and reasonable that they've kind of overcome all their flaws. And I think at that point, my temptation is always to do a brand new Diamond and to go, well, who is this person now? Like meeting them now, and let's try and maybe they've overcome a couple of flaws. Let's give them some new ones. Maybe some fears are dispatched with. Let's give them new ones. And I would be looking, because what that journey to the dark side or the true self really is it's a journey from three-dimensionality to two-dimensionality. And that's where I'd want to go. Let's fill this person out again.
And so with that, how would you advise about writing about a character who has depression and is not necessarily taking action, so could be considered dull, but still make them interesting?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because of course, something like depression is it's quite varied in how people can experience it and live with depression. And it can be something that can be very debilitating, and it can be something that is manageable to an extent. But I think it depends on the kind of story that you're telling. I mean, your beats might be quite slight. If it's a real character study and a piece, and it's about understanding like the world that someone's in and what their struggles are, I don't think you need to kind of make that person incredibly active and dynamic, but they still have a journey, even if the journey is getting dressed that day or admitting that maybe they need help. And you can still think about what their flaws are that are helping them, kind of what's getting in their way. So yeah, that's a really interesting one to kind of mull on, and it's something which I think active kind of means that they are your main character. I don't think it means that they have to be incredibly dynamic.
And staying on that diamond, Nadav is asking, can you talk a little bit about how the traits across the diamond register to each other and to stories? So for instance, when you created Stevie, where did you start and what followed?
Yeah, so they're numbered in the way they're numbered. I'm not quite sure why they're positioned the way they're positioned. That's a little bit of a mystery to me. It's probably Googleable. But the way that you work through them is meant to be numbered. So you start with the mask. So you go from the mask to the fear, to their strengths, to what gets them in trouble. Sorry, to their strengths, to their true self, to what gets them in trouble, to the dark side. So that's the way that you tend to kind of move through it, which is kind of, I think the really useful part of that is going from the mask to the fear, because you kind of move from what are they projecting outwards to what is motivating them inside.
Yeah. So yeah, how you presented Stevie to us is the way that people should be thinking in that order. But do you, you've talked a lot about Stevie being loosely based on your mom. And SJ Charles is asking, do you find it best and I guess easiest to base characters on people you know well, or pick up particular traits and create a character purely from your imagination?
I think that obviously there's a reality to it being someone that you know really well. But also, like, I don't know if my mom would recognize herself, like in that description. Like that's just things that I think are interesting about her. But I think part of being yourself is that you don't always think you're terribly interesting, and the way that you embrace the world is just what's natural to you. So I do think that probably what I would do if I was pinching from people that I know less well is I'd be trying to create an interiority that isn't that person, because I don't have access to that. I don't know kind of what their fears are. But I would think about what do I really like about that person, and I'd kind of go from there. And I think the problem that we often come to when we're creating characters is you end up with just someone that you really like, and they haven't got the flaws. And I think that's where you've kind of got to go, okay, I'm not just ripping this off my friend who I think's great. I'm making it something different. And often if you kind of sit with someone that is really arresting or interesting to you, the flaws come quite easily. So, you know, I have a friend who is very self-deprecating, very witty, would do anything for everyone, like very caring kind of person. Kind of doesn't share much about himself, like a little bit of a closed book in some ways, and it's always interested me. And then you kind of go, okay, well, like, putting that aside from my friend, what would a character be like if they're holding themselves apart? Is there a fear of intimacy there? Is there like a commitment phobia there? Is there a feeling that they're just not terribly interesting? Now, none of that might be relevant to my friend, but you begin down the path of the fear, and that can kind of lead you around, hopefully.
And how do you manage the interweaving details of characters' relationship with another, or the developing characteristic of a character? So it's been asked by Anonymous, but they say, I try and create a Bible, but find referring to that breaks my flow.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose ideally when you're creating multiple characters and you're kind of pinging them off each other, it's always worth just really thinking about what would these people like about each other, and what would they find really difficult about each other. And that might mean that if you're creating like a show Bible and you're creating groups of people and like maybe little networks of friendships or colleagues or whatever it might be, it kind of means that you might kind of end up grouping people in particular ways and different to what you thought, because you might think, actually, this person's just a bit too soft and sentimental for these other two. I'm going to pop them over there. But really, I mean, that's the most fun bit, is you just kind of put your diamonds up next to each other with kind of photos of, you know, your ideal casting, which is a really another fun part of the process, is thinking who would be cast as this person if it wasn't our gift. And sometimes that feeds back into it as well, because you start being really inspired by a certain actor or performer. And then it's just kind of like looking at how these strengths and weaknesses line up. And you might do an opposites attract, that two people are chalk and cheese, but they just get on, like their strengths and their weaknesses kind of complement each other. Or you might go, well, no, these two hate each other, you know, because this person is fundamentally can be quite selfish, and this other person's all about kind of being fair and being nice to everyone. And then you've got a little bit of a story engine and you start thinking we could put them together and really have something be explosive or interesting.
Okay, so if that's how you think about characters that are really different to each other, how do you think of characters that have similar traits? How do you make them distinct and individual to one another?
I mean, that's really difficult. Like, that is one of the biggest problems that you can have, basically, is when you realize that you've got two characters that are kind of quite similar. It's okay, I think, if they're superficially similar, but I think I'd be really wary about having their core self be too similar. And you can do really interesting things with storylines where you have kind of, you know, two best mates who seem like peas in a pod, and they dress alike and they do everything alike and their friendship is everything. But fundamentally, kind of one of them wants to have adventures and one of them wants to stay at home. And then you've kind of got people who look similar, and who the audience might confuse for the first 10 minutes of the film. And then they kind of go, hang on, there's way more going on here. But I think, yeah, I've had it occasionally where you realize that you've got two characters that are similar, and it's just difficult to put them in storylines together because they'll react in really similar ways. So it's like, who's driving it? Who's the person that does the unwise thing, or who's the person that causes the row? Because they're both, it's a bit like looking in the mirror. So it's a real problem, and I think it's not very helpful advice, but it's one best to avoid if you possibly can, or keep them at separate ends of your project.
Fair enough. And do you, I guess this is quite personal, but is there a fear or concern with you that your characters won't be represented the way you see them in your head? Or is this something that you always have time to make sure doesn't happen? It's a question from Annie Henderson.
I mean, it happens quite a lot, because once that character is being shared and they're cast, people bring really different energies and things. And sometimes a character that you felt really worked on the page is not as successful, and for all kinds of reasons. It might be that you haven't sharpened them up enough. They were a little bit blurry, they were a little bit vague, that diamond wasn't robust enough. Like, you didn't really think, I absolutely know who this person is. And sometimes that's pressure of time, or sometimes it's just that there's such a kind of a mismatch between the energy of the artist and the character that's kind of difficult. I mean, one thing that I think happens, that I've seen a few times on a few different shows, there's a phrase that I never really know what it means. I think it's slightly useless, but that phrase, kind of alpha male, gets talked about occasionally, and people will say, we need, like, let's create an alpha male, and I don't really know what that means these days.
It's always alpha male and strong female character, right?
Yeah, it's kind of, it feels so odd. And then they create this character who's kind of like swashbuckling, and he's a bit cocky, which apparently we're meant to find charming. I don't find that very charming, but like, and he's got like, and like, it's that thing of like, men want to be him and women want him and all of this kind of stuff. But I think that feels quite out of kilter with the time we live in. And when I think about the men that I know who just really know themselves and are confident, they're not anything like that. Like, they just kind of know their own mind, but are quite decent to people and often look out for people. And they're not kind of Lotharios that are sleeping with around. Because if you think about that kind of idea of, you know, that quite dated idea, that character, I would immediately think, oh, well, their flaws are really obvious. Like, I'm not worried about their flaws at all. Like, they're really flawed. So I think sometimes these archetypes can really get in our way, and it can kind of like limit us a little bit in the kind of characters that we seek to create, just to make them feel real and like we could meet them in the street.
Great, thank you. And we are reaching the end of the session. So I'm going to ask you just a couple of last, like, really quick questions about your career. So moving on from characters, but how do you get started becoming a story producer? Really quickly, is that like an easy, simple route in?
I was really enthusiastic about when I had a job interview and working on The Archers, but I got into radio through luck, really, and then I just moved around, always with an interest in drama and always interested in scripts and stories. And like if you work on scripts, you end up talking about character endlessly all the time. So.
And how much involvement do you as a story producer have in the final decision making for the casting of your characters in your current role?
It's a mix, really. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a bit less. It depends on the other pressures. I mean, like when you're casting a role, you've got to think about what the audience might feel about them, what that particular actor might bring to the part. So it was really nice with Ellie because one decision that I got to make, or as part of making, was that she's incredible with accents, and she's in the show with her own Northern Irish accent. I used to live in Belfast, so I'm a sucker for Northern Irish accent. But she also did a take where she had an RP accent. And I just felt really strongly. I was like, no, I really want like regional and national diversity on the show. So that was something I was able to kind of weigh in, and it kind of suits her, I think, and her kind of dry wit. So yeah, like a fair bit of involvement, but no final say at this stage.
And did you have to live in Wales to do the job that you do, or could you work remotely? Is that at all possible?
I think things are a bit different now, kind of after the pandemic. I mean, I really love Wales, so it suited me. And I'm very happy here. But I think it depends on the role, and I think it's always that thing of like if you get offered a role, it's part of your negotiation of how often, what are the expectations around being in the office, and then how you make that work for you.
Yeah, like any, or most jobs, at least. And finally, just to finish off, the last question for you, Jess is asking, what is the right setting for you to be in to write a good story or a good script?
Oh, well, one thing I learned way too late is that I'm a morning person. And what I do basically, this sounds weird, but I wake up in the morning and I have what I've called, I should trademark it, really boring mornings. So I don't listen to any podcasts. I love podcasts. I love radio. I don't listen to any podcasts, any TV, anything on YouTube. I just get up and I have breakfast and I get showered. And basically, I put my mind into a position where I'm so bored that I actually really want to write. And then I kind of just think, and I leave all email till like mid-morning. And I just have to, I think it's really important, whatever creative work you're doing, is think about when you flourish and try as much as you can to protect it and to kind of put like a bit of an edge, even if it's 45 minutes or if it's 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is. I think really kind of take seriously when you're at your best. I mean, I believe, because I'm a morning person, that you don't solve story problems after 4 p.m. Just I think everyone's brain is porridge and everyone's had lunch and they want to get home and it's the end of the day and you'll sleep on it and you'll come in the next morning and you'll have cracked it in your sleep.
Thank you so much for watching this BFI Film Academy lab session on why good people make bad characters and how to create characters for drama. We run monthly live digital labs events, and we would love for you to join us for our next session, which takes place on Monday, the 10th of June. In this session, we'll be building on today's lab and discussing how directors can work most effectively with their actors to bring their characters to life. To find out more about this session, visit our lab's webpage, which you can find in this video's YouTube description, and also follow BFI Film Academy on our social channels. Thank you so much and see you next time.